All right, guys, how we doing out there? So, welcome back to another episode of the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. I kind of took a week off last week, inadvertently. I was just busy doing things, and there wasn't a lot of really, interesting news kind of in the Russia-Ukraine realm. But what I want to talk about tonight is because this is actually the very first thing that I wanted to talk about in an episode of the podcast. But it's the idea of war crimes, and obviously it's kind of getting brought to the forefront right now because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so, again, I'm going to kind of speak conceptually, and I'm not really going to make the case necessarily like one way or the other. But I guess I want to ask you guys the question of: is there actually any such thing as a war crime, or are there only winners and losers of conflicts? So, kind of my premise with that, to kind of state my position is that there's not really any such thing as a war crime if you win. If you win, all is forgiven and all was justified. If you lose, lots of things are war crimes. Um, kind of looking. So let's kind of examine a little bit of, we'll use obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine right now as kind of a simple, in your face example. So obviously, as the Russians pulled out of the Kiev area and Bucha and things, we're kind of uncovering mass graves of people who are victims of torture, executions. There's been a lot of like widespread related reports of rape, lots of reports of theft, vandalism, otherwise, similar things like that. And so, and also conversely, there's been a lot of accusations of Russians specifically targeting civilian areas of Ukraine and things like that. And so I'm not going to take anyone's side in this because, as I've been saying, there isn't really a good guy or a bad guy in the Russia versus Ukraine thing. Like, Ukraine is not a good country. It is a massively corrupt country where pretty much all of America's elites go to hide their money and launder money and things like that through various energy companies and all sorts of things like that. I would say now, granted, them being invaded by Russia definitely makes them, gives them a moral upper hand in this. But so a couple things on that, like, sort of the current conflict is it one, if a person believes that, you know, any act committed in war can, in and of itself, be moral, then obviously, drawing lines becomes very difficult. And so, to kind of, speak about like the Russian attacks on, quote unquote, civilian structures, civilian areas. Well, once there's an actual, a war or a reasonably conventional war, there kind of really isn't any such thing as civilian populated areas because everything is civilian populated. Every single thing, with the exception of like military, well, not military bases have a lot of civilian, like, housing components, aside from like the actual firing ranges, I guess, on military bases, everything in a country is, it's civilian. So for example, the Ukrainians, and this is what they have to do. The Ukrainians are obviously, they have artillery in urban areas. They're hiding certain pieces of equipment and things inside of urban areas and warehouses and stuff like that to prevent it from being observed from the air and things, which is exactly what they should be doing. But conversely, there's not really anything morally wrong with Russia blowing up warehouses that they see, the Ukrainians parking vehicles and stuff in. I'm not going to, argue whether or not the war to begin itself is morally justified or anything like that. But just the attack on civilian infrastructure kind of doesn't really hold water because one, its proximity to military targets may make it a perfectly legitimate target, or it may make it, a target that's just going to suffer, incidental collateral damage because of where it's at. Any sort of public transit is also military transit when you're talking about a wartime footing. Any sort of like major infrastructure like bridges and other such things. Those are all military assets as much as they are civilian assets when there's a war going on. So you can't really make an argument that bombing or attacking such things in and of themselves are war crimes. I think where you start to get down to it is the specific targeting of non-combatants and things like that. But then one has to kind of get into the argument of what is a non-combatant, and does anything technically exist. So I'm going to kind of go back into the early 20th century because basically everything that I'm using air quotes here, basically everything that we know or that we state about the legality of actions within wartime conflicts stems from, like the late 19th century, the early 20th century, like 1907 with the Hague Convention, Geneva Convention 1929, and things like that. So basically everything from those kind of, that sort of era is kind of what influences like thinking today. Because prior to that, it just wasn't how countries by and large conducted wars. So not to get off track too much, but for example, the Russians, or the Soviets rather, doing mass deportations of people to Siberia, and things like that, while horrendous and results in millions of people dying. Pretty normal, historically speaking. Americans did the same thing with Indians. We wanted them off of specific areas where we wanted to move settlers in, so we walked them to places, to other places. Pretty normal. Again, I'm not going to support it or whatever. That's just pretty normal. If you look at World War One, it was very common. So Russia, or like the Baltic kind of states, Baltic areas of Russia have large ethnic German populations. Well, I mean, especially at this time, and so it was actually like a fair amount of like kind of purposeful swapping back and forth, where as the German Empire was fighting the Russian Empire on the Eastern Front of World War One, they were basically swapping back and forth. The Russians were basically kicking ethnic Germans out of Russia because obviously they didn't want them around, sucking up resources because they're German. Whereas conversely, the Germans were kicking ethnic, Slavs and Russians and things out of, the Baltic territories and Poland and things like that, back into the Russian Empire. So it's pretty standard, like pretty normal with that. So I kind of wanted to talk about a couple of like specific things because I think so like I said, we have the Hague Convention 1907, Geneva Convention 1929 and stuff, but I think the end of World War II and then, kind of the corresponding Nuremberg trials and things like that is basically where everyone gets their idea of wartime morality from. And so I'm just going to kind of point out some events and some things that transpired in World War II that should definitely make you kind of rethink some of that. So I'm not really going to go in any sort of like particular order here on a lot of things. So let's kind of talk. So we get to the end of World War II. So obviously we have the Nuremberg trials. So your main members of the UN, the Security Council, and then the kind of the presiding members here. So you've got Britain, you've got France, you've got America, you've got the Soviet Union at the time. So just for example, in 1932 to 1933, in just the Ukraine, during forced collectivization and all sorts of things like that, the Soviets caused what they call the Holodomor, which is basically a man-made terror famine in the Ukraine. In just the year, and mostly just, kind of the winter of 1932 to 1933, the Soviets killed between 3 and 9 million Ukrainians, like starved them to death. And they don't know the number. It's one of those, it's like, how do you judge whether somebody do they have to actually starve to death and fall down in the street to be a death from that? Or what if the guy starves almost to the point of death, but he survives, but then he ends up with massive health problems and dies, 25 years short of life expectancy? Does that count? Or what about like a pregnant woman who loses her baby? Or what about all of the young women who, because of being starved for so long, become infertile and basically cannot have children after that? So it's very difficult to kind of assess a specific number. But so like we said, 3 to 9 million is the estimate. Usually you tend to see right about in the middle of that as the number typically given. So for example, again, not to play light with things, but so the Nazis, so the Germans in World War II, famously murdered about 6 million Jews, gypsies, disabled people, and all sorts of things like that. Well, the Soviets killed more Ukrainians than that in just 1 year through man-made terror famine. However, they get to sit over and preside over Nuremberg trials. Kind of, okay, think of that what you will. Let's not even get into the Red Terror and decossacization, dekulakization, all those things. So we kind of move up to 1940. So obviously, so as we know, in 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. So in 1940, the Soviets went on a mass execution campaign in Poland, and they killed 22,000 Poles, and they buried them in the Katyn Forest, so the Katyn Forest massacre. And Stalin himself said they did it specifically to decapitate Poland in the future. So they killed primarily those who were educated in the officer class in the military, politicians, particularly powerful individuals. So basically, they tried to essentially kill off all of the most influential, powerful, intelligent, otherwise the kinds of people who could, help a country maintain a level of independence or autonomy going forward. And so it's actually, it was discovered, by the Germans later, and then the Germans committed their own very small Canteen Forest massacre. So the Eastern Front of World War II was, it was what it was. There's no, there's no getting around that. So then, so we'll kind of move into, so we could talk a little bit about, we can talk about America here. So, so America, obviously, so we're sitting, we preside the Nuremberg trials as well, and we hold ourselves up, to be particularly moral, comparatively, which I kind of don't really think there's a great argument for that. If you look at our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and other countries and things. Now, I mean, having been there myself and things, did we put pretty legit effort into trying to control civilian casualties when we could? Compared to, say, like how the Russians still operate, absolutely we did. But if you're going to get down to brass tacks, we were absolutely still dropping guided bombs in the middle of urban population centers. So that's just, I mean, that's exactly what you think it is. So let's kind of talk about a couple specific incidents with America in World War II. So first, the ultra famous Laconia Incident. So this happened in September of 1942. So Laconia was a British ship, and it's floating around Africa. It's on the far west side of Africa, and it's a troop ship, and it's spotted by a German submarine, German U-boat, and so the U-boat torpedoes it, and so basically they come up to kind of check out their damage, and they see like 2,000 people in the water. Well, it turns out it was a troop ship that was carrying primarily Italian POWs from the war in North Africa. So so the German commander of this U-boat, he basically immediately radios back to Kriegsmarine Command, informs them what's happened, and he was with a wolf pack, so a group of multiple U-boats called Eisbär or Polar Bear. So all of those, so they're all ordered to respond, and so Dönitz basically sends, essentially, is trying to send the entire U-boat fleet out to assist rescue operations. The German captain on the scene, he immediately begins flying red flag, comes up to surface, immediately starts assisting. So obviously you can't really hold a lot of people inside, but so they have people on the decks, and a lot of what they do is help people in the lifeboats, and then they begin towing people in the lifeboats towards shore. And now shore is a long ways away, obviously, which obviously is affecting this. And so there's also Vichy French ships get sent from the coast of West Africa out to assist. And so basically, essentially everybody is trying to put a pause on hey, let's pause the war. Let's go through rescue operations here. Well, as they're doing this, an American, B-25 flies over, and this rescue operation goes on for multiple days. So at one point, American B-25 flies over and attacks the U-boat and makes multiple passes. They're flying a Red Cross flag, all those sort of things. So basically, obviously, to protect his own crew, protect his own U-boat, and multiple U-boats, they basically have to cut all the lines, bring the Red Cross flag back in, they dive, get out of there. And so something like 1,400 Italian POWs end up perishing. It was 100 or a couple hundred British and, British and Indian. It wasn't Indian. Who else was in there with him? Anyways, a few other British Empire, soldiers end up perishing. When they find a lot of the washed up Italian POW bodies, a lot of them had bayonet wounds because basically as the ship got torpedoed and they were trying to escape, the people holding them in there basically locked all the doors on them and weren't letting them out. And so as they're trying to escape, they only had so much ammunition, so they're bayoneting them and everything like that. So then after that, Admiral Dönitz basically gives what's called the Laconia Order. And so up until this point, U-boats had primarily tried to follow what you typically called prize rules or cruiser rules. So cruiser rules, prize rules, basically what it would be is if you're a German U-boat and you approach a merchant ship that you're going to attack, if there's no escorting vessels and if you can approach it safely, you basically surface, you approach it, you essentially go, hey, we're going to sink you, and you give everyone time to, get in lifeboats, and all that sort of thing, get off of the ship. Once they're clear, then you torpedo it. Or if you're a surface ship, then you hit it with your guns, whatever else. And so that was pretty standard for, and so obviously I said this is 1942. So this is very standard up until this point. So during the, kind of the happy times, as they say, of the U-boat operations, against the Allies, that's primarily how they operated. So they would try to assist like that. So Laconia Order, they forbade that from happening. Can't assist anyone else. Need to, can't take any prisoners, nothing like that. And so, really funny story with this is, so when you get to the Nuremberg trials at the end of World War II, so Admiral Dönitz is basically going to be tried for war crimes, and specifically for unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Laconia Order is one of these that's specifically given. So none other than Chester Nimitz himself testifies on behalf of Karl Dönitz and basically says not only did he not break any sort of, you know, gentlemanly laws or legitimate laws or anything else, America did exactly the same and worse against the Japanese. And at no time did Americans follow cruiser rules or prize rules when attacking Japanese merchant shipping or anything like that. And so he's not convicted. He's exonerated at trial basically because of that. Another incident, probably the most famous one concerning Americans, and that's Operation Meeting House. So the firebombing of Tokyo in early March of 1945. So some of you might know this, some of you might not. So the firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945 is the single most deadly air attack in the history of the world. As many people died during that one attack that one night as both atomic bombs combined. And so basically, so Tokyo is, a town, it's a city, very high population density, lots of wood construction, things like that. So America, we launched this huge raid, lots of B-29. So basically, kind of like aircraft. And so you had multiple ways, but also aircraft are carrying multiple things. So one, high explosives and also incendiary. So the point of high explosives in these type of raids is to cause structural damage so that one, incendiaries can get inside of buildings where they cause more damage and things like that, but also just to create more general rubble, general pieces of wood and things like that that are more easy to burn, and catch on fire. So the estimated casualty account, the lowest figure given is 80,000. The highest figure given is 130,000 dead in one night from the firebombing. But I've seen some more modern estimates that think that even that is extremely low. Given the population density of Tokyo at the time, something like 15 million people would have been present in the city that one night. And so the casualties are just unbelievably enormous. And if you go look up the pictures for that, it's the most frightening thing you ever saw. Because you're talking about a firestorm, people engulfed instantly, so just burned in place. Like they just basically got frozen in place, burned to death right there. Again, complete civil, and it was absolutely strictly an attack against civilian population on that. So pretty, and then obviously we dropped the 2 atomic bombs as well on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the war. So then, let's talk a little bit about the British. And so the British, the biggest, kind of hit against them is, so obviously the British were in action basically from 1939 until the end of the war in Europe. And RAF Bomber Command was active, throughout the war. And if you look up the casualty statistics, like the RAF Bomber Command got absolutely slaughtered. Just their casualty count just dwarfs Americans, which is funny considering that, all the arguments that went through about, the dangers of daylight bombing and all those things when the Americans were coming through in 1942 and Bomber Command flying at night when they were dealing with the Kamm-Huber line and things were just getting absolutely slaughtered. So while the British claimed, to be conducting a strategic air war, and I guess they could, what the standard British loadout was, for the most part, was typically one or a couple 2,000-pound bombs, what they usually call cookies, or a 4,000-pound bomb. And these were literally just a regular cylinder filled with explosive. No fins, no nothing. And then the rest of the entire bomb load, so tens of thousands of pounds of incendiaries. And so basically, the entire purpose was that obviously the cookie, the large, high explosive bombs would hit, and the main idea was they wanted to blow the rooftops and the coverings off of buildings so that the incendiaries could get inside. And the actual stated purpose, if you listen to, there's actual quotes from Arthur Bomber Harris, so the head of RAF Bomber Command, was that they wanted to kill as many civilians as possible to affect the workforce, destroy as many houses as possible to affect the workforce. They wanted to displace as many people as possible, cause as much loss of sleep and fatigue as possible. And so while they claimed, while the claim is that, this was, justifiable or whatever, the British basically, entirely just conducted campaigns of terror bombing throughout all of World War II. And some of it worked extremely well, some of it did not. The Ruhr campaign, against the steel production of Nazi Germany was very successful, but other ones, they, again, primarily just conducted literally just against the civilian population on purpose. Whereas the Americans, at least plausibly, were attacking industry with high explosives. But again, you send you send several hundred B-17s, B-24s over a city. You're only going to be so accurate dropping thousands of 500-pound bombs and things like that. So you pretty much know what you're getting there. So kind of moving another one of this is the British and the Canadians. So talking about so things that basically led to the Commando Order. So people who know the Commando Order is basically an order from Hitler himself that was any sabotage units, commando units, or other such types of units of the Allies that were captured by the Germans were to be executed, executed basically as spies. So executed, turned over to the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the security detachment of the SS, and executed. And so while that is, according to the modern way of thinking, illegal, a couple of specific things precipitated that. So if you guys go back to 1942, so in August, so the British launched British Canadian launched Operation Jubilee, which was the large scale, the reconnaissance in force, or the raid against Dieppe. And so the Canadians supplied the vast majority of the men. There were British commando elements. There was a small contingent of American commando elements basically attached to the British. And a lot of it was basically, the whole idea behind this was that they wanted to kind of attack a defended port, see how long it could be held, and a lot of this was like a learning process because obviously they didn't know how to conduct a major cross-channel invasion, what would eventually be, the invasion of Normandy in 1944. But so when they did this, so a Canadian officer was actually, captured on the beach, and he had all of the plans with him. He tried to bury him when the Germans were coming. The Germans, found it still. And within there explicitly was listed that all of the POWs were supposed to be shackled, which violates, any of the sort of statutes, when you're talking about POWs being shackled. And so that was one of the major things. It was actually like a long running, there was kind of a tit for tat, shackle battle between the Germans and the Canadians for a while, because basically the Germans then shackled all the Canadians they captured. In retaliation, the Canadians shackle all the Germans that they had back in Canada and stuff like that. And the other thing that led to that was what was called the Sark raid. So the Sark raid took place same year, a couple months later, basically. And so commando element landed on an island, Sark Island, and with the goal of capturing some POWs. So they captured, I think it was 4 Germans, and so they tied them. They shoved grass in their mouths, and so basically, as this, now granted, obviously the story is told by the British who were capturing them, and then one of the Germans who escaped. As the story was told, one of the POWs, called out to warn one of the other Germans, so he was killed. Another one was knifed to death. One ran away and was shot, and one managed to run away and escape. And basically, or I take that back. So one ran away and escaped. One was shot. One was stabbed, and then one remained captured and was taken back with them. And so then this was given as another reason that Hitler gave for the Commando Order, which was the shackling of POWs, and then the shackling and the binding, or the gagging, and then the execution of German POWs. So again, this is I'm not trying to justify anyone's actions. However, there's a very specific cause and effect with a lot of these things. So kind of some other things to talk about. Kind of before we sort of wrap up and move on. So the Moroccans, so obviously, the French, French Morocco had some of native Moroccan fighters called Goumier, and they fought with the Allies in Italy, and they're actually very well respected by the Allies, and for their prowess and for their aggression. But they committed at least 7,000 rapes in Italy, and accordingly, in one particular set of villages, it was over 700 men, women, and children, and apparently they even raped some priests and things. The stories are kind of ludicrous, really. And it was so bad that, not the Allies didn't punish anyone. The actual response of the Allies was that they basically imported a bunch of Berber women to be quote unquote camp followers, i.e. prostitutes, who were only to be allowed around the Moroccan Goumier. Basically to I guess, try to satiate their their lust with some Berber women. So that's one way to go about it. Um, so then, kind of also in 1943, we had what's called the Bengal famine. So obviously, at this time, the British were still in control or nominal control of India. The Japanese were invading Burma, which is on the east side of what's now Bangladesh. At the time, was still British India. And so there's a lot of reasons, but the Bengal famine killed something between 2 and 3 million. Um, Indians in Bengal, which is had a population of about 60 million. So that's pretty substantial total number. And part of it was due to drought, but a lot of it was due to man-made actions. Basically, it was what you'd call a policy of denial. So they purposely burned fields, were conducting a scorched earth sort of withdrawal through that area. They burned lots of boats, all the transport, seed, and all sorts of things. Anything that could go along with that, and the production of rice and all those sort of things. The British destroyed to deny it potentially to the Japanese in the future, and then basically kept a lot of the best stuff for themselves to feed their own troops and things like that. And so again, in Bengal, population of about 60 million, 2 to 3 million died of a primarily man-made famine there, and then. Kind of wanted to go back in history just a little bit more here. So we go back to the Second Boer War, which is the very end of the 19th century. So the British are fighting against the South African Boers, and so they kind of implemented what we would recognize now today as like kind of the concentration camp sort of system. So they basically they forcibly removed all the Boers that were around, sent the women and the children to concentration camps in South Africa itself, or otherwise British-controlled territories. The men they primarily sent off-continent, so all the men they basically displaced, relocated. They destroyed all the farms, livestock, crops, everything, destroyed it, burned it all. Tens of thousands of Boers died. They don't really know. The lowest number given is like 28,000 just in the camps specifically. So, so I kind of sort of use that information again, not to try to say, oh hey, all these things are justified, or hey, we're the good guys, or hey, you're for sure the bad guys. What I wanted to kind of get across with some of that is that when we're thinking about war crimes and whether or not we actually think something is a war crime, historically speaking, it tends to come down to who wins or loses primarily. But if you can in any way justify a military action that you're in, then it becomes very difficult to actually draw a line of what becomes acceptable or not acceptable. So again, to use the example from World War II. So if you're fighting an enemy, their industrial output is absolutely a major component of their ability to fight. So anything you can do to attack that industrial output is an attack against the military, but that means you're going to be attacking a lot of women, children, old men, or otherwise wounded or infirmed men and things like that. So is that acceptable? I don't know. Now, conversely, this kind of leads you into some obvious questions. So what about attacking military hospitals? So obviously the general idea is that you don't attack hospitals that are flying the Red Cross flag labeled specifically as hospitals, or the targeting of medics, hospital ships, things like that. It's kind of considered the honorable thing to do. But then I asked the question, so if it was okay to attack these men when they were in the field, it was okay to cause these casualties in battle, but they get withdrawn to an aid station, they get withdrawn back to a surgical hospital or something like that. From a strictly military standpoint, is it not a very good idea to bomb this hospital and now further deny, men to the enemy? Because i.e. a certain number of casualties are going to be what you call routine or priority. So people who will be back, eligible for, service, relatively quickly. So technically speaking, denying them the medical care is a smart idea, at least logistically speaking. Same thing with, civilian related infrastructure, things like that. If you want to kind of really go down the pathway of hurting your soul when you think about some of this stuff, specifically attacking civilians tends to draw out a lot of first responder and otherwise, kind of emergency related personnel, which could be doing something differently. Also makes them, ripe for attack. And it's very comparable to, attacking work crews, cleanup crews. So it's very common practice, especially when the Allies were attacking oil-related facilities and production of the Third Reich during World War II, that they would drop bombs with a substantial delay, like multiple hours. And the idea was once the cleanup crews come in, start cleaning stuff up, try to get things back in working order. Now, a couple hours later, these bombs go off and kill these people that are trying to repair these facilities. So, is that justified or is that not justified? And again, I'm not really going to argue one way or the other. I'm a person who I like to present facts and real life examples to people and try to shock people a little bit into, kind of rethinking their positions on some stuff with that. So again, asking the question, what is a war crime, or is there any such thing as a war crime? But remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.